Sefer Devarim, and since my father's Yahrtzeit is on Vav Av, it was just days before Tisha B'Av. Now, as you know, Sefer Devarim is a compilation of speeches that were given by Moshe Rabenu to Bnei Yisrael right as they were about to enter Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe recaps the events of the preceding years. What I found really noteworthy is that so much effort and so much space within the Torah is spent on this review of events that occurred. Now, keep in mind that the Torah had already recorded these events, and Moshe could have just reread the existing text, but instead he restates these historic events, and he often describes them differently. I think one of the most classic examples is also one of the first events that are described in Devarim, which is Chet HaMeraglim, which coincidentally also occurs on Tisha B'Av. When the event occurred in Parshat Shlach, it's described that Hashem instructs Moshe to send the spies, and the verb that is used is latur et haaretz, what latur means. In contrast, when Moshe repeats it in Devarim, he describes that the people asked Moshe to send the spies, and the verb is different. It's either lachpor or liragel, which is where meraglim come from. What I want to suggest is that one purpose is to revisit events with the benefit of time, distance, and objectivity, as Moshe does in Sefer Devarim. It allows us to see them in their historic context and to learn a different and maybe even more appropriate message from those events. It's very hard to have perspective in the moment, especially at a time of stress. And often it's only with time that we can see things more clearly. Specifically, with respect to the Meraglim, Rashi describes it that the people were acting ba'arbuva, chaotically. The young pushing past the old pushing past the leaders. They became very confused in the moment, and they misinterpreted what Hashem had approved them to do when they sent the spies. And only later in Devarim can we see the disconnect between what the people's idea was and what Hashem had intended. And specifically, the Malbim explains the difference between those verbs, latur and liragel, that latur, what Hashem had authorized, was this trip to see the greatness of the land, to show the truth of the promise that Hashem had made, and to excite the Jews into taking possession. But in their momentary panic at the moment, the Jews instead sent the spies liragel, which was to discover the weakness of the land, because they were stressed, they were insecure, and they were worried about suddenly having to engage in warfare, and they were seeking reassurance that they could conquer the people. And that's why when they heard, even after hearing how great the land was, when they heard how strong the people and the cities were, they stressed they couldn't handle it, and thus Chet HaMeraglim. And it really took all those years until Sefer Devarim, when Moshe was able to speak to the Jews when they were in a calmer frame of mind, to explain that difference between how they should have behaved and how they did behave. It happens, I also think this is a good analogy to when you're commemorating a Yahrtzeit. You know, when you lose a loved one, it's very hard not to be overwhelmed by the trauma and the emotions of the moment. And it takes some time before you can reflect back on the person's life and their accomplishments, and to be reminded of their vibrancy and their passions throughout their life, and then focus on what we can learn from them and how we should behave to give them proper tribute. Now it happens, I also think that that's a great transition to Sam Kean, tonight's speaker. To introduce Sam, he's a prolific and award-winning author. His stories have appeared in publications including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Psychology Today. His work's been featured on shows including NPR's Radio Lab and All Things Considered, and he is the author of several books, including The Bastard Brigade and The Disappearing Spoon. Now, The Disappearing Spoon in particular is not tonight's focus, I don't think, but it's the story of the discovery of each element of the periodic table. And for those of you who knew my father, who started his career with a PhD in chemistry, it should come as no surprise that this was a book he really enjoyed, and he actually recommended to me several years ago. Sam also hosts a podcast called also The Disappearing Spoon, which he describes as a sciencey history podcast where footnotes become the real story. I happen to be a real avid listener, and I find it to be a great combination of science, history, and colorful storytelling, which I also think would be a good way to describe my father. Now, in his podcasts, what Sam does, the way I feel them, he's revisiting historic events from a different perspective with the benefit of time and historic context. And he encourages us to look back at events that we may already think that we're familiar with, but to see them from a different point of view that helps us learn a lesson. So basically, I think Sam is a fascinating and educating storyteller. I think my father would have appreciated hearing from him, and I hope you will too. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to the New York Times bestseller, Sam Kean.
All right, well, hello, everyone. Let me pull up my slides here, just so make sure that works. Okay. Okay, is that working?
It is. Before you begin, let me just remind people that we're going to have Q&A at the end. I'll unmute, and I forget how to do this to get people to raise their hands, but we will have Q&A at the end.
Okay, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me tonight. So I have a mix of different stories for you all about Jewish scientists, Jewish lore, Jewish genetics, things like that. And I'm going to focus especially on some stories related to the First and the Second World War. But before we get there, I thought I'd actually jump way back and start with some tales from ancient times from my book, The Violinist's Thumb, about genetics. So because Jewish history is so well documented, archaeologists have long been interested in correlating some of the historical tales with genetics to see how well they match up. So obviously the Old Testament chronicles how the Jews once divided themselves into the kingdoms of Judea and Israel, independent states that probably developed distinct genetic markers, since people tended to marry sort of within their own group. So there wasn't as much mixing because of that division. And actually nowadays, after many millennia of Jewish exiles and diasporas, many historians have sort of given up hope of tracking exactly where the remnants of each of the kingdoms had ended up. But it happens that there are certain genetic signatures among different Jewish groups, especially unique stretches of DNA, where they can detect that, in fact, these different groupings still hold today. So they can actually tell that these divisions have existed through time, including some of them among the original 12 tribes of Israel. So you can actually see some of the different markers where you can actually see that these divisions did hold up over time, and that because these divisions have persisted, this gives strong support to the idea that these were not just, legends or some sort of spiritual truth that has been passed down or, distorted over time, that there actually was a lot of good factual basis for these divisions. So it gives a lot of support to this idea that what was being represented in those stories actually did happen, which I think is pretty cool. Being able to use something like a modern tool like genetics to be able to go back and kind of provide support for these stories when so much time has passed. So that's kind of a cool thing they can do it nowadays with genetics. And more specifically, some other things that geneticists have been able to do is they've been able to trace the origin of the Jewish priestly caste. As I'm sure you know much better than I, the Kohanim all supposedly descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And they often have special ceremonial rites in temple and things like that. And specifically, this honor often passes from the father to the son within a line. Now, what's interesting about this pattern of passing from a father to a son is that that's the exact same thing that happens genetically with the passage of the Y chromosome. So genetically, females are XX with regard to the sex chromosomes. They have two X chromosomes, whereas males are XY. So males get their Y chromosome from their father whole and intact. So they get the whole thing, it gets passed down as a unit. So if you are male, you inherit your Y chromosome from your father full and intact. And so if the Kohanim really are a distinct line descended from Aaron, their Y chromosome should be quite similar. And it turns out that Kohanim across the world do indeed have very similar Y chromosomes. So this indicates more or less a single patriarchal line. And furthermore, geneticists know that mutations pop up in DNA at a consistent rate over time. So if you look at mutations over a long stretch of time, they provide sort of a biological clock to date events. And I talk about the details a little bit more in my book, but basically it's a biological clock by looking at mutations in DNA. If you look at all the slightly different mutations in Kohanim Y chromosomes today, and then kind of trace them back in time, they all seem to come from a single person who lived roughly in Moses and Aaron's day. So once again, this provides some confirmation to the truth of the Jewish tradition on this. So another kind of cool thing that they're able to provide support with through this modern science of genetics. And there are other traditions as well, ones that in some cases are a bit outside the mainstream of Jewish tradition, at least in the United States. And the one I'm thinking of in particular involves a tribe of people in Southern Africa, South Africa and Zimbabwe, called the Lemba people. And according to them, they have Jewish roots. And for a long time, archaeologists really didn't think their story seemed very credible. They claimed that ages and ages ago, a man named, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Bubba or Buba, but B-U-B-A, that this man, Bubba, he left Israel, went to Southern Africa, and to this day, the Lemba people there continue to shun pork. They circumcise their boys. They wear yarmulkes. They decorate their homes with six-sided stars. So they have a lot of traditions that we would recognize as part of the mainstream Jewish tradition. Now, obviously, some cultural transmission has taken place here. But the story of this person, this Bubba guy, sounded pretty far-fetched to archaeologists. They assumed it was just ideas diffusing down to Southern Africa, not necessarily people diffusing down there. But it turns out that the DNA of the Lemba does support this position, because roughly 10% of the Lemba men overall, and half of the people in the oldest families there, the priestly caste, do have none other than that Kohanim Y chromosome. And there's since been some controversy over these results and how to interpret it. So the science is a bit unsettled nowadays. But if it holds up, there might actually be a branch of the Jewish tree now in Southern Africa, which I think is a pretty cool idea, that this sort of thing they thought was kind of far-fetched ended up being supported by the science of genetics. I love when sort of the history and the science kind of coalesce like that. I think it's a pretty cool thing. And there's one more thing I wanted to talk about with genetics and Judaism, something that I think is probably the coolest of these stories that we've talked about. And it turns on the fact that Jewish people overall were very sharp observers of hereditary phenomena. In particular, in this case, something involving circumcisions, and especially deaths resulting from circumcisions. So by about the year 200 AD, the Talmud included an exception to not circumcise a boy if two older brothers had bled to death after their circumcisions. And they probably died from hemophilia, which is an inability of blood to clot. What's more, though, is that Jewish law later exempted half-brothers of the deceased as well, but only if those brothers shared the same mother. Now, if the half-brothers had shared a father, then the circumcisions were supposed to proceed. And the other exemption was that the children of women whose sisters' babies had bled to death also received exemptions, but not the children of men whose brothers' babies had. So clearly, Jewish people understood a long time ago that this disease in question, hemophilia, is a sex-linked disease that affects mostly males, but gets passed down through the mother. Now, obviously, they didn't know all the details about, DNA and genetics and things like that back then. But it is a pretty remarkable observation that they were able to build up over probably several centuries. And I'm very impressed not only at the keenness of the observation in that, but the fact that they were passing down enough information over and over time to really nail this down. And it really anticipates exactly what scientists later learn about the genetic qualities of this disease, hemophilia. So I think it's a really remarkable story. And the fact that, it's in the Talmud, that this little genetic nugget is in there, I think is a really cool thing. So that's some of the things I kind of talk about in this book, is about, the genetics, the tradition, and things like that. And because Jewish tradition is so rich in that way, a lot of these stories do end up intersecting with Judaism and different aspects of Jewish history. So I think that's pretty cool. So again, that's some things about Jewish lore and genetics. There was a Talmud picture I didn't get to. But for the rest of the talk, I would like to focus on some individual Jewish scientists and their stories. And one of these stories, the first one, takes place during World War I. And the first sign of this story comes from my book, Caesar's Last Breath. And the story involves this scientist right here, a man named Fritz Haber, sort of an aristocratic scientist, had a very distinct look, as you can see, with the completely bald head, little scar in the middle, the little pince-nez glasses that he wore. And Haber truly had one of the great minds in all of history for chemistry. And in the very early 1900s, he became one of the most famous scientists in all of the world. And in short, what he did is he figured out how to convert one of the most common chemicals in the world into an industrial product. And that common chemical is the nitrogen in the air around us. So nitrogen overall makes up roughly 4 out of every 5 molecules that we breathe. It's the largest component of the air by far. And nitrogen is essential for our bodies to function as well. It appears in our DNA, it appears in every protein. It is vital for all forms of life. And in fact, the main point of fertilizers that we use on crops, fertilizers like this, the main point of fertilizers is to get nitrogen into the soil. That's the main function of what they're trying to do, so that plants can suck it up, it can get inside plants. And also carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps, when they trap insects and they start to digest them, it's the bug's nitrogen that they're after. So in a lot of ways, the cycle of life is really the cycle of nitrogen. Nitrogen is a very hard component to get. And that's why a lot of fertilizer efforts like that really go into making nitrogen available to plants. And now you might be thinking there's a bit of a contradiction there, because nitrogen is so vital for life, but it makes up 4 out of every 5 molecules we breathe, 80% of the air around us. So why can't we just breathe in all this nitrogen and get our nitrogen that way? Well, the answer is that the nitrogen in the air is too unreactive. Those individual molecules will not react with anything we have in our body and become something useful. So that was the conundrum that Fritz Haber faced. Nitrogen was vital for fertilizers and for life, and we live in a sea of nitrogen all around us, but we can't use that nitrogen or turn it into anything useful, not until Fritz Haber came along. And there were many individual steps that Haber used in the process to capture nitrogen. Many chemicals appeared and disappeared and so on. But basically, Haber took nitrogen, heated it to hundreds of degrees, injected some hydrogen gas into it, turned the pressure way up to hundreds of times greater than normal air pressure, added a few metals as catalysts, things like that, and voila. He was able to figure out a recipe to turn nitrogen into ammonia, which is a precursor for fertilizers. And suddenly, cheap industrial fertilizers were available, which meant that farmers were no longer limited to compost piles or dung or things like that to nourish the soil. And even by the time World War I broke out in 1914, so maybe just 7-8 years later after Haber figured out this process, even by 1914, Haber had already saved millions of people from starvation. And we can still thank him today for feeding most of the world's nearly 8 billion people. I've seen estimates that roughly half of all people on Earth would not be alive today without this process that Fritz Haber figured out. So in some ways, he seems like one of the biggest scientific heroes in history, one of the greatest benefactors that humankind has ever seen. Unfortunately, though, there is another side, a darker side to Haber's legacy. And that is that Haber, he did make this product, ammonia, that went into fertilizers, but he actually pursued cheap fertilizers for a different reason. His goal was to make explosives for the German military, the same sort of explosives that, say, Timothy McVeigh used in his fertilizer bomb in Oklahoma City in 1995. He was much more interested, Haber was, in nitrogen and death than he was in nitrogen and life. And a few years into World War I, after he'd helped build up the German munitions industry, things took an even darker turn for Haber. Because after World War I broke out, German military leaders recruited Haber for their gas warfares division. Basically, World War I was a bunch of trenches in the mud, and there was a big stalemate. And the German military leaders were hoping that gas warfare might help them break this stalemate. And Haber was the one they thought could do this, could break the stalemate. And Haber himself was very excited to join the military. He became a captain in the military. He had this big uniform that he wore around, kind of strutting around his scientific institute in it. He took sort of a childish joy in joining the German military. And his family actually was far less impressed than Haber was with his newfound status, especially his wife, Clara. Clara actually happened to be a brilliant scientist herself. For instance, she was the first woman to earn a PhD from her university. But unlike other women at the time, like Marie Curie, Clara never got the support she really needed to go out on her own and develop into her own scientist. Because instead of marrying someone who would support her interests, someone like maybe Pierre Curie, Clara ended up marrying Haber, who, as one historian put it, he never let her out of her apron. He was always sort of pressing her to do things, and he had kind of this oppressive, assertive personality that really sort of crushed her own hopes and dreams. She had to support him all the time. She never got opportunities to do things on her own. And so she ended up kind of having to subsume herself to him for the most part. But despite this kind of dynamic in their relationship, she absolutely refused to work on gas warfare. She considered it immoral, she considered it evil, and she wanted it to stop. But Haber didn't care. Haber wanted to keep pursuing this because, again, he loved Germany, and he was actually hugely ambitious about this project. And in fact, even though Haber came from a long Jewish line, he'd actually renounced Judaism and converted to Lutheranism in Germany because he thought it would help his career. He really didn't believe in Lutheranism at all, but he just did it because he wanted to be seen as a German person. And he thought sort of by renouncing Judaism, he could become even more German than he was. So he renounced Judaism just for the sake of his career. And in my book, I explain a little bit more about Haber, some of those picture of Clara. I explain a little bit more about Haber and some of the gas attacks that he went through and all kind of the hair-raising details. But overall, Haber and his minions developed some of the worst gases of World War I, including ones like chlorine and mustard gas. And Haber was not some sort of behind-the-scenes scientist either. He was actually on the field with the military, directing in person the very first gas attacks of World War I. Some of them that left thousands of people scarred and maimed in Belgium and other places on the Western Front. And when Haber revealed all this, his wife Clara was horrified. She thought it was the worst thing he'd ever done. And after he returned from directing the gas attacks at the front, she confronted Fritz and she demanded that he stop these gas warfare attacks. But sort of as usual, he did not listen to her. And in fact, he threw a dinner party that night to celebrate these new weapons. And even worse than that, Clara found out that he was just coming home for one night. It was actually one night, and then he was on his way to direct more gas attacks on the Eastern Front against the Russians. So he was all in, he was all committed to these gas warfare attacks. And that night, Fritz and Clara ended up quarreling quite violently. And Clara was so distraught about the whole thing that later that night, she walked into the family garden with Fritz's army pistol, and she actually shot herself with the pistol, ended up committing suicide because she just didn't feel like she could support this person who was doing these awful gas warfare attacks. And, you know, Fritz was, of course, upset by the death of his wife, But he didn't let him inconvenience him. And he, in fact, kept going to the front the next day without even bothering to make the funeral arrangements. So he was really that committed to kind of building up the glory of Germany, even if it meant kind of disregarding his own family in that way. So World War II overall was pretty horrific, and Haber's gas warfare transformed it to another level of awfulness. It was a true nightmare at this point because soldiers could no longer take for granted even the air that they breathed. They couldn't even trust that, all thanks to Fritz Haber's chemical genius. Now, of course, Germany eventually lost the war despite Haber's work. And after the war, the international reaction to Haber was pretty complicated because in 1919, he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on producing fertilizers from the nitrogen in the air. But then, just 1 year later, in 1920, he was denounced and was charged as an international war criminal for his role in the gas warfare attacks during World War II. So it's really kind of this contradictory, almost self-canceling legacy where you really don't know what to think about Fritz Haber with these two completely different aspects of his legacy. And soon things got even worse for Haber and for Germany. Despite losing the war, Haber still loved Germany as much as ever, and he was furious about the huge reparations that Germany had to pay the Allies. So he spent 6 futile years on a project trying to extract gold from seawater in order to basically pay the reparations himself. And he spent years and years on this process before he finally gave up. Then he did some other projects that kind of sputtered along just as uselessly. One of them, for instance, he developed an insecticide that he called Zyklon for a few years that just kind of went nowhere. Eventually, he had to sort of give this up. Eventually, though, in the early 1930s, a new regime took over Germany, the Nazis. And even though Haber had been a war hero, and even though he had converted to Lutheranism, the Nazis despised him for his Jewish roots. And remarkably, Haber ended up becoming one of the great defenders of the Jewish people during the early days of the Nazi reign. He protested a lot of their moves, dismissing professors and things like that from their posts. He really proved himself brave against all odds, basically standing up for the Jewish people, despite the fact that he had renounced it earlier. So in some ways, he ended up kind of redeeming himself on a moral level by standing up against the Nazis. Eventually, though, the Nazis became too powerful and they sent him into exile. And Haber eventually died while traveling to Palestine, where he was trying to seek refuge. But he ended up dying stateless, broke and alone, because the Nazis had basically wiped him out. And there is kind of one twist at the end of this story, in that work eventually continued on that insecticide that I mentioned a moment ago called Zyklon. A German chemical company ended up producing a second generation of the gas, a more powerful and efficient version of it. And if the first one, they called Zyklon A, and this became Zyklon B. And this, of course, was the gas that the Nazis used in the gas chambers during the Holocaust to kill millions of Jewish people, including murdering several relatives of Haber. So Haber obviously wasn't alive to see this, but it's amazing to see how the Nazis ended up twisting his work and just sort of digging the knife in even deeper into Haber by using something he'd invented to go after relatives and to go after millions and millions of more people. And overall, I find the story of Fritz Haber to be one of the more fascinating stories in science history, because he's really one of these Faustian figures. Someone who did incredible good on the one hand with the nitrogen work and the fertilizer, saving countless people from starvation, but someone who did tremendous harm on the other hand, starting the gas warfare program that terrorized countless more people. He's all of the good and all of the bad of science rolled into one. And again, I just find him one of the really more fascinating characters in science history. And I think you could debate endlessly whether he was a force for good or a force for bad in the world. So that was the story of Fritz Haber and World War I. And then I wanted to move on to World War II and talk a little bit about a story from my book, The Bastard Brigade. So in addition to the Holocaust, one of the other effects of the Nazi regime on the Jewish community in Europe was a diaspora of Jewish scientists, many of them who ended up coming to the United States to work on various projects like radar and especially the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. And I'm sure we all know about the broad strokes of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. But I'd like to wrap up tonight with a story about a lesser known aspect of the Manhattan Project from my book, The Bastard Brigade. So in short, we all basically know how World War II ended with 2 black mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I don't think a lot of people realize how easily things could have gone the other way. How easily the war could have ended not with an American bomb, not with an American bomb, but a German one, obliterating not a Japanese city, but somewhere like Paris or London, or possibly even New York. And in fact, scientists on the Manhattan Project, especially the Jewish scientists there who had been in Europe and who had seen how destructive the Nazi regime was, they were terrified that Germany had the inside track on building the atomic bomb. After all, German scientists had discovered uranium fission, which powers the bomb. They had discovered uranium fission in the first place, and they had some ferociously smart scientists like Werner Heisenberg working for them on their atomic bomb project, which they called the Uranium Club. And in fact, the Uranium Club had been founded in Germany in 1939. So at the very start of the war, they were already focused on harnessing the power of uranium and of atomic power to help the German war machine. So they had a big head start on the Allies' Manhattan Project. And they were terrified that German scientists were going to build a bomb, hand it to Hitler, and that he was going to destroy the world with it. And this fear overall had 2 big effects. In that first, it pushed American scientists to work like maniacs on the atomic bomb, to work very, very hard to make sure that they got the bomb first and not Hitler. But the second effect was that it convinced the Allies to go to desperate lengths to stop the Uranium Club, to stop those German scientists, to try to spy on them, to sabotage them, and in some cases even try to assassinate members of the Nazi atomic bomb project. And the Bastard Brigade focuses on those missions and on the men and the women behind them. Sometimes these were heroic missions. Sometimes they were frankly kind of low down and dirty. Sometimes they were madcap adventures, sometimes deadly disasters. In the book, I examine different threads of the story. The Nobel Prize winners, the Hollywood starlets, the baseball players, the Kennedy family plays a role, all of these different characters. All of them were focused on trying to keep the bomb, though, away from Adolf Hitler. And tonight, just to wrap up, I wanted to focus on a couple of these characters. One in particular, or 2 of the characters in particular. One of them was this man right here, a character named Samuel Goudsmit, who was the leader of what was called the All-Sauce Mission. And a moment ago, I mentioned with regard to the Uranium Club that there were certain Allied scientists whose job it was to spy on the Uranium Club. And Samuel Goudsmit was the head of that group that was trying to spy on the Uranium Club, and later in the war actually trying to seize and even kidnap members of the Nazi atomic bomb project. And for Goudsmit, Samuel Goudsmit, this really was a personal mission. He was Jewish. He had grown up in Holland and later immigrated to the United States in the mid-1920s. But he had a lot of family back in Holland. And he actually had grown up friends with certain scientists there. This is the logo of the All-Sauce Mission right there. But here's a picture of Goudsmit. He's on the far left there. And in the middle there, you can see Werner Heisenberg, the famous Jewish scientist. This was kind of in the before times, before World War II started. But Goudsmit and Heisenberg were very, very good friends, very close friends before the war. Heisenberg had visited Goudsmit's house, his family. He had, stayed overnight there, had dinner with his parents, all these sorts of things. So Goudsmit felt this was a very personal betrayal when Heisenberg then went to work on the Nazi atomic bomb project. He felt personally betrayed by Heisenberg. And even more personal, I mentioned Goudsmit had family in Holland, back in Holland, including his parents. And his parents ended up getting swept up into a concentration camp in 1941, at which point he lost all contact with them. So while Goudsmit went over to Europe, back to Europe, to spy on members of the Nazi atomic bomb project, he was also going over there trying to find information about his parents. What happened to them? Were they still alive? Were they being cared for? What was going on with them? So during this book, he's really on this double quest, both to stop the Germans, the atomic bomb, but also to find his parents and see if he can save their lives as well. And to me, this double quest, this sort of big-minded scientific quest, but also this personal quest of Goudsmit's, is really kind of the emotional core of the book. So that was one of the two characters, was Samuel Goudsmit. And the other character that I wanted to mention was this man right here, a man named Mo Berg. So Mo Berg was born in a pretty rough and tumble part of Newark, New Jersey, and had a pretty tough and scrappy childhood, born in the very early 1900s, to give you sort of the time frame. But Mo Berg was a certified genius in that Berg could speak at least a half a dozen languages. Some people said a full dozen languages. And he ended up enrolling at Princeton University at just age 16. So very, very smart, spoke all these languages. And after he graduated from Princeton, he decided he wanted to attend the Sorbonne, the famous university in Paris, to continue his education. But to his disappointment, he had to put off going to the Sorbonne for several months until the late fall. And so why did he have to put off going to the Sorbonne until the late fall? Well, because in his spare time, Mo Berg was also a Major League Baseball player. He had a contract, and the team would not let him go to Sorbonne until the season ended. So he spent the summer right after graduating Princeton, all through October, playing professional baseball. And then he sailed off in the off season to study Latin at the Sorbonne, kind of like a lot of baseball players do nowadays, right? Kind of in their spare time. Other off seasons, Mo Berg ended up traveling through Japan and India and the Middle East at a time when that was not very common to travel around the world like that. And still later, he attended Columbia Law School in his spare time, fitting it around his Major League Baseball career. The man was truly, truly brilliant. He was also truly, truly strange. In fact, Casey Stengel once called Mo Berg the strangest person to ever play professional baseball. Well, if you know anything about professional baseball, is kind of saying something. It attracts a lot of strange people, a lot of oddballs, but Berg was apparently the strangest one of all. And I explained some of the anecdotes about him in the book, how he would buy dictionaries to see if they were complete and all these just quirky little things that made Mo Berg such a unique character in baseball history. And so I love this paradox, kind of this big, lumbering, unibrowed catcher from Jersey who also attended the Sorbonne. And Mo Berg was a big, huge deal in his day. You can see him here on a trip he took with the all-star baseball team to Japan. You can see Babe Ruth there. There's Lou Gehrig off to the side. So Berg was a very, very big deal, kind of hanging around with these Hall of Famers, a very famous professional baseball player. But when World War II broke out, Berg joined the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA. And the OSS cooked up a heck of a mission for Mo Berg. It involved Werner Heisenberg, that scientist I mentioned before, who again was part of the Nazi atomic bomb project and was a brilliant, brilliant scientist. Nobel Prize winner, came up with the uncertainty principle, but was again deeply entrenched working for the Nazis. So the OSS decided that maybe it would be a good idea to bump Heisenberg off, to assassinate him. And the person they picked to do this was Mo Berg. And again, this became a bit of a personal mission for Mo Berg because he was Jewish He hated the Nazis. He hated how anti-intellectual they were, how they burned books and did all these terrible things. And he sort of made it his mission that he was going to do his part to stop the Nazi atomic bomb project. So in December, I should say, 1944, the OSS sent Mo Berg undercover into Switzerland, which was a neutral country, sent Mo Berg undercover into Switzerland with two things in his pocket. And he attended a lecture by Werner Heisenberg that Heisenberg was giving there. And he had two things in his pocket. He had a pistol, which he was supposed to use to potentially shoot Heisenberg if he got any hint that the Nazis were close to making an atomic bomb. And the other thing he had in his pocket was he had some cyanide pills. And if he got caught or arrested or something like that, it was his duty to take the cyanide pills after assassinating Werner Heisenberg, because he knew too much about the atomic secrets of the United States, and he couldn't risk falling into enemy hands. And I just think this is a fascinating and in some ways really kind of crazy story to think about sending someone in to murder, essentially to assassinate one of the most famous scientists in the world. I mean, that's crazy by itself in the first place. It would have been a gigantic international incident, especially in a neutral country like Switzerland. But the person they picked to do this was one of the most famous athletes in the world. I mean, think about sending, LeBron James or someone like that in to assassinate a Nobel Prize winner, and you can see about what level this plot was. But again, that fear of Adolf Hitler, of Germany getting the atomic bomb, was so big and looming so large in people's minds that even crazy ideas like sending Mo Berg in to assassinate Werner Heisenberg got the green light, and they went forward with it. So that brings me to the end of the talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I did want to put in one quick plug again for my podcast, The Disappearing Spoon, which has all new stories that are not found in my books. But overall, I just hope you enjoyed the stories tonight and hope you can check out the books. And at this point, I am happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Sam. Really interesting stuff. And I have to say, I've been hosting these Zooms, since March, and I don't think I've ever been on one where we grew the audience along the way. Usually people don't.
Oh, okay. That's good to hear.
So yeah, you should be very proud. I've never seen that. Okay, so I think maybe put the questions in the chat and I'll read them off. Does that make sense? That way everyone's not talking on top of each other and interrupting each other, something we haven't seen in this country very much lately on Zooms or in public forums. I don't see anybody chatting. Oh, here's a chat. Let's see here. Robin and Danny Amster. Super interesting. What got you into this field, Sam?
Well, I was going to be a scientist myself till I was a physics major in college. And then I got about 2.5, 3 years into my physics degree and just basically realized it wasn't for me. I still really loved it, got good grades, everything. But I was in labs all the time. I just found the work very tedious, very boring. And I didn't want to specialize either, kind of the way you have to nowadays in science. You have to have a very narrow focus. So I just decided to kind of explore something else. And I'd always loved stories, loved storytelling. Eventually ended up getting an English major on top of my physics major. So I was kind of using both sides of my brain there. And eventually realized that what I really liked was telling stories about science, finding scientific heroes and villains, conflict, drama, all that kind of juicy stuff. So writing these books turned out to be a really kind of perfect mix of those two worlds. So I feel very lucky to be able to do it.
Thank you. I have some comments about the Zoom. People couldn't get in before, but that's not a question for you. So I will not share that with you. Okay. Could Sam speak? Oh, that went away here. Hold on 1 second. Could Sam speak about the circumstances of Fritz Haber heading to Palestine/Israel towards the end of his life? Did he reconnect with his Jewish roots?
I don't know. I don't remember all the details off the top of my head. I talk about it more in the book. He ended up going to England for a while, but was kind of scorned there because a lot of the English scientists remembered the gas warfare from World War I. And I believe he actually ended up dying in Switzerland, which was a neutral country. I don't know how much he connected with his Jewish roots, but again, in the book, I talk a little bit more about how he was one of the few people who was prominent enough and brave enough to really stand up against a lot of the laws that were targeting Jewish professors specifically, but Jewish people in general. So he at least reconnected, and to the extent that he was defending them against the Nazi regime, which was fairly brave and something that not a lot of people had the standing to do the way that he did.
Do you have any sense that he felt bad about his earlier actions in facilitating death and being focused on the killing so much?
No, he thought he was all justified because it was for the greater good of Germany.
Germany. Okay. Did you see the Moberg? This is from Esther Needle to everyone. Did you see the Moberg movie with Paul Rudd? Did it follow the true story overall?
I have not seen it. I've heard mixed things about it. They tried to introduce some elements into his personal life. There was some speculation, I think, in the movie that he might have been homosexual and some other things. So it was a bit of a Hollywood version where they tried to introduce some things. So I don't know how accurately it followed his real life. I was consulting more. There was some biographies about him, went to his archives up at Princeton, did some things like that. So I haven't seen the movie.
Dr. Roberta Straukler says, didn't he die in, that went away, in Switzerland? I guess this is regarding Fritz Haber.
He did die in Switzerland. He was trying to get to Palestine at the time. But yeah, he died in Switzerland, yeah.
All right, Dov Lando and family, jointly, they asked the following question. How do you find all these stories?
It's just a matter of reading very widely. I don't think there is any sort of trick to it. I pick up a lot of different books. I'm constantly reading, and I'm constantly thinking about it. You know, could this be a story? Could I do something like this? But basically, it's a matter of just sitting down and reading a lot of different things and sort of keeping track of them, having a system to keep track of them. I have a file on my computer with lots of different story ideas, stuff like that. And in fact, I started the podcast in part because I had so many great stories that just didn't fit in the book and the books, and I wanted to do something with them. So the podcast became kind of a way to spend them out there. But basically, I just try to read, you know, in economics or history or literature, just whatever I can to find fodder for stories.
Okay, this is from Talia Lando to everyone as well. Wasn't there a fear in sending a famous person like Moberg to be an assassin? Not very subtle approach, Talia says.
It was not, no. And in fact, the head of the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves, initially rejected Berg for that reason. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that Moberg really had kind of this spell over people where people were just amazed and wowed by him. He was a very smart person, but he was also a Major League Baseball player. So all of the the jocks and the military people were blown away by his intellect, whereas all of the scientists and the intellectuals were wowed by his athletic prowess. So it just happens to be that Leslie Groves was one of those people who kind of fell under Moberg's spell, and despite the fact that it was a crazy idea, ended up approving it. I will say that Moberg, because he spoke all those languages, could blend in Switzerland fairly well. So that's one advantage he did have. But beyond that, it was kind of a crazy idea.
Although you could argue he's the least expected spy if you're a famous baseball player, you would think.
I guess. He did get recognized by a bunch of American GIs while he was over there, wandering around Europe. So.
Larry Cohen makes a very nice point. Thank you, Dov Lando. Would have been really capitalized. We would really have enjoyed these stories. I can't speak for him, but I think it probably would have as well.
Well, I'm honored to be able to do it in his honor. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Dr. Roberta Straukler to everyone. In the play Copenhagen, Heisenberg supposedly was undermining the German project. That's interesting. Did you find any evidence of that?
I've heard that, and some people have argued that. There's no real evidence for that beyond what Heisenberg and others claimed after the war, which is obviously self-serving. There's no firm evidence that they were undermining it. I think the best way to put it about Heisenberg is that he was very naive. in that he was curious about atomic processes, and he thought he could just keep going with it. And then at the end, he would be able to stop and not go forward with it, or that even he could, build some sort of atomic apparatus and then use that as a bargaining chip and, use that against Hitler and say, if you don't shape up, then I'm not going to, give this to Germany or something. So I think he was very naive about the amount of power that he had relative to people like Hitler and Goring. I don't think he was definitely not an active, ardent Nazi, but because he was so naive, he was dangerous in some ways as well.
Very interesting. I'll ask the question. Where do you said you use archives, letters, what other research methods do you use? Because you can't, most of the time you can't talk to family members. It's maybe grandchildren of families. Do you do that at all?
Sometimes it depends. I write for, magazines, newspapers, things like that. So in that case, I would. And in some cases, if the people are alive, but it's mostly archives, letters, things like that. Historians have, gone through, so academic journals, things like that. But those are the main ones, I would say. All
right. So I'll ask one last question, or two actually. Who do you like to read in your genre? And the last question usually you get for this kind of thing is, what's your next book? What are you working on now?
Next book, okay. People I like to read with nonfiction. Some people I can recommend are Amy Stewart's a great science writer. Deborah Bloom's written some great books. Carl Zimmer does a column for the New York Times. He has some great books. David Quammen's a fantastic science writer. I really enjoy that. The Making of the Atomic Bomb is one of my favorite science history books. It's a big doorstop, but it's a great book. And if you like science fiction-y stuff, I really enjoy Neil Stephenson. He's sort of a modern kind of maximalist writer. It's a little more of the hardcore science fiction with a lot of science in it. A bit on the softer side with a bit of hand-waving sometimes, but just really great characters and good about the people in science. Connie Willis is a great science fiction writer as well. So I would recommend those writers.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I just want to thank both Dov and the entire family, and thank Sam for sure for coming, being with us. We can't be together in person, but maybe one day we will be. And thank you for everyone for joining. It's late at night, and there are all kinds of things going on. So I want to thank everyone's participation, and stay well and be well. Thank you again.
Okay. I can mention my next book, if anyone has any interest.
Please.
Yeah, okay. So it's coming out next summer. It's going to be called something like The Ice Pick Surgeon. And basically it's stories about scientists who were so obsessed with some topic, some research topic, that they went way too far. And they often committed ethical breaches, but in some cases even committed outright crimes in pursuit of these scientific topics. And there are some very obvious ones, including the doctors during the Holocaust. But there's other examples too of people, who are sabotaging each other. There's a pirate involved. There's the lobotomist of the title, the ice pick surgeon. So kind of a mix of a lot of different scientists who were really obsessed. And it's kind of a mix of true crime and scientific discovery. So it's kind of an unusual combination there. Wow. And I can add, if people do have questions, they can find me on my website and they can write me through there. I think it's just samkean.com/contact, or it's just samkean@gmail.com. That's fine as well. So if you have questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you everyone again, and pre-order that book for next year. Bye. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.